Hello, I have Selena here with me, and we are going to do a new lesson. It might be new for you, it also might be review for some of you, and some of you might have seen it. We had recorded a lesson with exponents, and at the end I was like, oh, some of you might need to be able to do this other skill, and so I gave it as a little bit at the end of a different lesson. And so you may have already seen this somewhere else, but this is going to be something new. It's how we work with multiplication. But before we jump in, we need to create a table in our math journal that helps us know what our answer in multiplication will be. And so when you are doing your follow-up in your journal, you're going to use your next paper, which would be this one, but as usual, I'm using marker to show on here, and so I can't use the back side. It will show through, or it will bleed through to the other side where we have our other work. And so you will use your next available page. I have to use my next page. All right, and also you will be writing in pencil, and I will be writing in pen. And I'm sorry if you're hearing noises in the background. Our kittens are playing with their toys and throwing them down the stairs. Just like a kitten and a small child. Okay, so when we have talked about multiplying, and specifically like multiplying on the checkerboard, we say a lot, I have my unit times my unit, or my 10 times my unit, and we talk about what that means. When we use the checkerboard though, the checkerboard, when we put the beads on, the square we use tells us what category it's going to be by what color it is. So a unit times a unit is a green square, so it's a unit. But a unit times the 10, that square becomes blue. And so a unit times a 10 is 10. And I want to create a table of all the different ways we can make the different values. So I'm going to write up here, I'm not sure what I want to title this page yet. So I'm going to actually leave my title blank, but I'm going to leave a space for my title right at the top. Okay, so first we're going to be talking about all the ways we make units. A unit, and I'm going to also use a U like that. I'm going to switch us into the other view so you can see more clearly what it is I'm writing. There we go. Sorry about that. I always forget that when I restart a lesson that the sound gets all adjusted. So I'm going to call this cross multiplication. That is what the lesson eventually will be. I was thinking that this table might have a special name, but I don't think it does. Multiplicate LTI. This is why we don't use pen.
Just make it a capital.
Multiplication. So that's why you use pencils, not pen for writing. Multiplication, that is a C and then an A. That's an A. Okay, so the ways we make a unit, there's only one way to make a unit. It is a unit times a unit. There's only one way to make a unit. We have a unit times a unit. I'm going to put a little line there. And now we're going to look at 10. And we're going to abbreviate that with a T. Now, there are two ways to make 10. We can multiply a 10 times a unit, or we can multiply a unit times a 10. There's two ways to make a 10. So I'm going to put a line there. That's all the ways to make a 10. Now we're going to make 100, and I'm not going to have room to write all of these. 100. And we're going to use an H for that, 100H. Okay, let's think of all the ways we can make 100. We can multiply 100 times a unit. Oh, I know what would make this even easier. Selena, will you go grab the checkerboard? It'd be easier if we had the checkerboard in front of us and we could look at all these ways we can make 100. We can, when we're making this table, normally in class we would have the material in front of us, but I wasn't sure how much space we were going to have to work. And it might be hard to see some of this in our workspace. but we can get started with it. Let me see here.
Do you want me to lift it up?
Nope. Okay. And you know that I don't let you use your writing materials on top of the checkerboard, but we don't have another workspace. So we're going to do that a little bit different than we would do in class. Okay, so we found to make a unit, the only way to make a unit is to multiply a unit, there we go, times a unit. And then we were looking at our 10, and I'm going to switch to the other view so you can see better. Okay, now when we're looking at tens, we can see that to make a 10, we can multiply a 10 times a unit, or we can multiply a unit times a 10. That's how we get the blue tens. Now we're looking at our hundreds. So I started with our 100 times a unit. That's one way. Then we have this way right here, which is 10 times a 10. 10 times 10 gives us 100. And what's this other way?
Unit times 100. Or, yes.
Yep, a unit times 100. Those are the three ways. Those are the only three ways that we can make 100. I'm going to put a little line there because that's all the ways to make 100. Now we're going to do 1,000, and we're going to use a TH for 1,000 because T was for 10. So 1,000, and we're going to use a TH. Okay, now I have to move our checkerboard over this way a little bit. Here's our first 1,000. We get our 1,000 by multiplying 1,000 times a unit. 1,000 times a unit. We're going to write that as a TH times a U, 1,000 times a unit. And now we have this one right here. So we have 100 times
1,000. No, 10.
She wasn't actually looking where she was looking. She was looking where I was pointing.
Yes.
100 times a 10. An H times a T. H times T, 100 times 10. Now we're looking at this 1,000, and this 1,000 is made by multiplying
10
times
100.
a 10 times 100. And we have one more 1,000. It's this one way up here in the corner. And we make that by multiplying a unit times
1,000.
a unit times 1,000. And maybe you're noticing a pattern here, and especially if you've done some laws of multiplication work, maybe you're noticing like 100 times a unit and a unit times 100. In multiplication, they're the same thing. That we call that the commutative property, that it doesn't matter which order you multiply by, the answer is the same. And so like here we had 1,000 times a unit. We also had a unit times 1,000, same thing. 100 times a 10 and a 10 times 100, same thing. So once you know half of them, you really know all of them. Okay, let's go back in here. And now we're going to look at 10,000. 10,000. And we're going to put that as a T for 10 and a TH for 1,000. TTH, 10,000. And we're going to look at the ways we can make 10,000. Here's our first one. We take the 10,000 multiplied by
A unit.
a unit. 10,000 times a unit. 10,000 times a unit. Okay. And then we have another one right here, which is the 1,000 times
A 10.
So 1,000 TH times a T, 1,000 times 10. And then we have this one, which is 100 times
100.
100 times 100, H times H. And one more up here,
10.
10 times
1,000.
a 10 times 1,000. And I know that you guys have had this experience with the checkerboard that the material ends. And sometimes when you're doing a really big problem, you have to go borrow a checkerboard from another class. And with that work, you know that this extends beyond. So we can extrapolate beyond. We know that there would be another blue one right here. And that would be a unit times a 10,000. So we can record all of those if we want. the material only goes this big, but we know that a unit times a 10,000 would give us the same. And a unit times a 10,000. Okay. I don't think I'm going to fit any more here. We wouldn't fit all of them. So I'm going to move myself right over here. And we are going to look at the 100,000. And for 100,000, we're just going to, it'll be HTH because it will have 100 and 1,000. I'm just going to box those up. And if I were doing this as follow-up, I would do this outside border in a colored pencil color. I'm just using the same color for you while I'm writing because that's easy to see. Okay, now we're doing 100,000. And I had to write that on 2 lines because it's such a big word, 100,000, and it's going to be an HTH. Okay, now on our checkerboard, this is the 100,000. It's red, and we can see. Whoa! Okay, there it is. 100,000 times the unit row. So we have an HTH times a unit. 100,000 times a unit gives us 100,000. Then we also have this 100,000, which is 10,000 times
10.
a 10,000 times a 10. 10,000 times a 10. All right. Now we have this one. This is 1,000 times
100.
1,000 times 100. And this one here is 100 times
1,000.
100 times 1,000. That was one of those, like we just talked about, 1,000 times 100 and 100 times 1,000. We know they're the same. Our material ends, but we know the commutative law of multiplication. So the next one would be the opposite of this one, 10,000 times 10. So 10 times 10,000. And our last one would be the opposite of this, unit times 100,000.
Way up there.
It'd be way off the screen. That would be the end of your second checkerboard up there. And I'm going to put a line. And you can see how this just goes on and on and on. We're going to do to the million because million's fun, but we're not going to go up to 100 million because you see the pattern. Million, and we're going to use an M. Okay, here's our checkerboard. Here's our million. You get a million by multiplying a million by
The unit.
a million times a unit. Okay, and we also get a million by multiplying 100,000.
By 10.
100,000. And then we get it also by multiplying a 10,000.
Times 100.
10,000 times 100. We also get a million by multiplying 1,000 times
1,000.
1,000 times 1,000 is a million. Okay, and then we already know because of the commutative law that they repeat. So we know that after 1,000, we look at 100, and 100 times a 10,000, the opposite of this one. And then we look at our 10, and it'd be 10 times 100,000, and our unit times a million. Those are all the ways that we multiply to get up to a million. Now, we can use this chart to help us with some other work when we're wondering what category we get. Say when we multiply 100 times 100, we can just look on here and we can look for H times H. It's right here. Gives us a 10,000. 100 times 100 gives us 10,000 right here. So if you have the material, you can look at the color. If you have your paper, you can use your table of numbers here. Okay,